In that December of 218 before Christ, 40,000 Roman soldiers marched toward a frozen river, convinced they would crush a foreign army that had dared to invade Italy. On the other side of the dark water, a Carthaginian general watched them with the eyes of a predator. His name was Hannibal Barca, and that river would become his masterpiece. But the Romans did not know what awaited them. They did not know that their soaked and freezing bodies would be attacked by men who were warm and well-fed. They did not know that war elephants awaited them beyond the mist. And they did not know that, hidden in a ravine covered with vegetation, 2,000 soldiers waited in absolute silence to strike them from behind. And then hell descended upon them. Stones whistled through the air, arrows tore through the frozen haze. Elephants crushed men like insects beneath their feet. Screams echoed across the plain. Shields shattered. Blood stained the snow vivid red. And when the Romans finally believed they were winning in the center, they heard the most terrifying sound of their lives, trumpets blaring at their backs. 2,000 men emerged from nowhere, swords in hand, transforming the battle into massacre. When the sun set over the Trebia River, 20,000 Romans lay dead, and the general who had crossed the Alps with elephants had just proven that he was no ordinary invader. He was the nightmare Rome had never imagined. The story that led them to that field of death began decades earlier, in the ashes of a previous war. Rome and Carthage had first clashed between 264 and 241 before Christ, a brutal dispute for control of Sicily that would become known as the First Punic War. Carthage lost. The defeat cost more than territory. It cost pride, wealth, and thousands of lives. Rome imposed a crushing indemnity, and Carthage bled to pay it. Among the Carthaginians who swore revenge was Hannibal Barca, a general who had fought with distinction in the Lost War. It is said that he took his eldest son, still a boy, to a sacred altar and made him swear eternal hatred toward Rome. That boy was only 9 years old. His name was Hannibal. Hamilcar turned his ambitions toward Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, where he built a Carthaginian empire destined to finance the revenge his son would one day execute. When Hamilcar died, his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, assumed command, expanding Carthaginian dominion to the Ebro River. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 before Christ, the army acclaimed as their leader the young man who had grown up among soldiers, the son of Hamilcar, who was now 25 years old. Hannibal Barca finally had the power to fulfill his oath. Rome watched the Carthaginian expansion in Hispania with growing concern. A treaty had established the Ebro River as the boundary between spheres of influence, but south of that, line lay Saguntum, a city that maintained ties of friendship with Rome. In 219, Hannibal besieged Saguntum. Rome demanded he withdraw. Carthage refused. War was declared, but Hannibal did not wait for Rome to come to him. His plan was audacious to the point of madness: cross the Pyrenees, traverse Gaul, scale the Alps, and bring the war to the heart of Italy. While Rome planned to invade Africa, Hannibal was about to appear at the gates of their cities. In the spring of 218, Hannibal departed from New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, with an impressive army: 50,000 infantry soldiers, 9,000 cavalry, 37 war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees, leaving his brother Hasdrubal to protect Hispania. He traversed southern Gaul, facing hostile tribes and treacherous rivers, and then he reached the Alps. The Alpine crossing lasted 15 days of pure torment. Winter arrived early in the mountains, and the Carthaginian army faced snow, ice, narrow gorges, and hostile tribes that rolled boulders onto the marching columns. Men plummeted from cliffs, horses broke their legs on slippery trails. Elephants, creatures of African heat, died from the cold. When Hannibal finally descended into the plains of northern Italy, He had lost nearly a third of his army. Of the 37 elephants, only a fraction had survived. But he still had 20,000 infantry soldiers hardened by the march and nearly 6,000 cavalry. And more importantly, he had something Rome did not expect: audacity. Hannibal was in Italy, and Rome had no idea where he was until it was already too late. The first news of Hannibal's presence in northern Italy reached Rome like thunder from a clear sky. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had departed with an army to intercept the Carthaginians in Gaul, but discovered that Hannibal had already crossed the Rhone and was marching toward the Alps. Scipio sent his brother Gnaeus with most of the troops to Hispania and returned to Italy to organize the defense. In November, the two armies met for the first time on the banks of the Ticinus River. It was merely a cavalry skirmish, but the result was revealing. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, light, fast, and deadly accurate, massacred the Roman horsemen. Scipio himself was wounded, saved from death only by the heroic intervention of his teenage son, who would one day become the famous Scipio Africanus. The Romans retreated, crossed the Po River, and established a defensive camp near the Trebia River. Rome could not ignore the threat. The other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was in Sicily preparing an invasion of Africa. Urgent orders summoned him north. In just 40 days, Sempronius marched his army of more than 25,000 men across the peninsula and joined Scipio on the banks of the Trebia. Together, the two consular armies totaled about 40,000 soldiers. Sempronius was an ambitious and impulsive man. His term as consul would end soon, and he longed for a victory that would guarantee his glory. Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, counseled caution. Winter was coming. Hannibal faced supply problems in hostile territory. Time favored Rome. They only needed to wait. But Hannibal knew his enemies. His spies informed him about the rivalry between the consuls, about Sempronius's impatience, about the Roman system of alternating command. The consuls took turns commanding every other day. Hannibal only needed to wait for Sempronius's day. On the other side of the river, Hannibal prepared the battlefield with the precision of a craftsman. The plain west of the Trebia seemed at first glance ideal terrain for the eye. Romans, open space, no obstacles for legionary formations. But Hannibal had explored every meter of that land. He found a ravine covered with vegetation, an old dry stream bed hidden by dense brush, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. It was the perfect place for an ambush. The night before the battle, Hannibal called for his younger brother. Mago was barely in his early 20s, but already an experienced commander. Hannibal entrusted him with 1,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry, all elite veterans. The order was simple: hide in the ravine before dawn, make no sound, light no fire, wait until the Romans were fully engaged in battle, and then strike from behind. While Mago and his men disappeared into the darkness, Hannibal gave other orders. His soldiers were to eat well and sleep early. Before leaving their tents, they were to grease themselves with animal fat, protection against the brutal cold that awaited them. The horses were to be fed and warmed. Everything was to be ready before dawn. On the other side of the river, the Romans slept, without knowing that their fate was already sealed. The dawn of December 22nd, 218 before Christ, was born grey and cruel. A fine snow fell over the plain and the air cut like a blade. The Trebia River ran black and frozen, its waters swollen by autumn rains. Before the sun even appeared on the horizon, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry crossed the river. They were light men, mounted on small but hardy horses, armed only with javelins and leather shields. Their objective was not to fight, it was to provoke. The Numidians attacked the Roman outposts, hurling javelins and shouting insults. Some came close enough for the Romans to see their mocking faces. It was a deliberate provocation, calculated to awaken Sempronius's fury, and it worked perfectly. Sempronius awoke to the sounds of battle. Without waiting for reports from his scouts, without consulting the wounded Scipio, without even ordering his men to eat breakfast, the consul gave the order Hannibal was waiting for: general advance. 40,000 Roman soldiers emerged from their tents in the cold of early morning. Without food in their stomachs, with muscles stiff from sleep, they formed their ranks and marched toward the river. The snow continued to fall, and the wind cut through their tunics. The Trebia River was not wide, but its waters were deep at that time of year, reaching the legionaries' chests. The first soldiers entered the water and felt the cold penetrate to their bones. It was physical pain, a shock that stole their breath and made their muscles contract. But Roman discipline was unshakable. Man after man, rank after rank, the army crossed. When the Romans finally emerged on the western bank, they were soaked, shivering, exhausted. Their hands could barely hold their weapons, their legs could barely hold them up, and before them, formed in perfect lines, Hannibal's army waited. The Carthaginians were rested, they were fed. Their bodies gleamed with the fat that protected them from the cold. Hannibal had transformed winter into a weapon. The Carthaginian formation was carefully planned. In the center, Hannibal positioned his 20,000 infantry soldiers in a thin line. The newly recruited Gallic warriors in the middle, flanked by the African and Iberian veterans. On both wings, 5,000 cavalry on each side, including the feared Numidians and the heavy Gallic horsemen. In front of the main line, a screen of skirmishers, slingers from the Balearic Islands, famous for their deadly accuracy, and African archers. And, somewhere beyond Roman sight, the war elephants waited. The Romans also formed their lines. It was the traditional formation that had conquered Italy. 16,000 legionaries in the center, arranged in 3 lines of battle. On the wings, 10,000 Italian allied soldiers on each side, and at the extremities, the Roman cavalry. Merely 4,000 horsemen against Hannibal's 10,000. The disproportion in cavalry would define the battle. The first phase of combat belonged to the skirmishers. The Balearic slingers advanced, whirling their slings with deadly precision. Lead stones whistled through the frozen air, striking helmets, shields, faces. The Roman velites, the light infantry of the Republic, tried to respond, but they were wet, shivering, and their javelins flew without force. The Carthaginians forced them to retreat before the main line even entered combat. Then came the elephants. The Romans had never faced war elephants on Italian soil. They knew the beasts from accounts of the war against Pyrrhus decades before, but nothing had prepared them for the reality. The animals advanced on the wings of the Roman formation, trumpeting, trampling, like towers of flesh and fury. Their handlers guided them directly against the Italian allied infantry, who panicked. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry attacked. The Numidians, light and fast, enveloped the Roman horsemen like wolves surrounding sheep. The Gallic cavalry, heavy and brutal, launched devastating frontal charges. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered more than 2 to 1, collapsed within minutes. Men were thrown from their mounts. Horses tumbled in the snow-stained red. The survivors fled, leaving the flanks of the Roman infantry completely exposed. But in the center, something different was happening. The Roman legionaries, despite the cold, the hunger and the exhaustion, were soldiers of exceptional quality. Their discipline was legendary. Their combat technique perfected over generations, and they outnumbered the Carthaginian infantry in the center. The lines collided with a crash of metal and flesh. The Romans advanced, their short gladi finding gaps in enemy defenses. The Gallic warriors in Hannibal's center began to give way. Step by step, the legionaries pushed forward, cutting, stabbing, killing. For a moment, it seemed that Roman discipline might prevail. Hannibal watched from an elevation, his face impassive. His officers grew uneasy when they saw the center yielding, but the Carthaginian general gave no order to retreat. He waited, and then the moment arrived. the Carthaginian cavalry, having destroyed. Their Roman opponents turned toward the infantry. From the flanks, thousands of horsemen attacked the unprotected legionaries. The Balearic slingers regrouped and unleashed a rain of stones upon the Roman ranks. The elephants, having scattered the allied infantry, now advanced against the center, and from the rear came the killing blow. Mago had waited hours in the frozen ravine. His men remained motionless, breathing slowly, buried in the vegetation. When the signal finally came, they emerged like ghosts from the earth. 2,000 elite soldiers attacked the Roman rear in the middle of battle formation. The legionaries, already pressed from all sides, heard screams at their backs and saw steel flashing where there should have been only snow. The impact was devastating. The discipline that had sustained the Roman advance shattered. Panic spread like fire through dry straw. Men who had fought with courage realized they were surrounded, that there was nowhere to flee, that death was coming from every direction. Some threw down their weapons and ran. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would not come. The snow turned crimson as the Carthaginians massacred the trapped Romans. Only one group managed to escape: 10,000 legionaries. The most experienced and disciplined, grouped in close formation and simply marched through the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal had no reserves to stop them. All his men were engaged in the slaughter. This group crossed the frozen river a second time, their bodies now numb to the cold, and marched without stopping until they reached Placentia. For the rest, there was no escape. The battlefield transformed into a slaughterhouse. Men drowned trying to cross the river. Others were trampled by elephants. Thousands fell under Carthaginian swords, their screams echoing across the plain, until finally, silence descended. When the snow stopped falling and the clouds parted, the winter sun illuminated a scene of absolute devastation. Bodies covered the plain as far as the eye could see. Broken weapons lay in the red snow. Roman standards, pride of the legions, were scattered in the mud like forgotten rags. Hannibal rode across the battlefield in silence. His officers accompanied him, counting the dead, collecting prisoners. The numbers that emerged were extraordinary. Between 15,000 and 20,000 Romans had perished. Another 12 to 15,000 were captured. Carthaginian losses did not exceed 5,000, most of them Gallic warriors who had borne the weight of the Roman attack in the center. Hannibal himself showed no joy. This was only the first step on a much longer journey. Rome would not fall because of a single battle, but the message had been sent. The general who had crossed the Alps was an adversary unlike any Rome had ever faced. For the Romans, news of the disaster arrived like an earthquake. The Senate met in emergency session. Mothers wept for sons who would never return. The streets of Rome filled with mourning and fear. For the first time in generations, citizens wondered if the city's walls would be enough to protect them. Tiberius Sempronius Longus survived the battle, as did Publius Cornelius Scipio, but their military careers were stained forever. The defeat at the Trebia would be remembered as an example of recklessness, of arrogance, of underestimating an enemy who should have been respected. Hannibal, for his part, spent the winter consolidating his position. The Gallic tribes of northern Italy, who had suffered under Roman domination for decades, saw in the Carthaginian victory an opportunity. Thousands of warriors joined Hannibal, replenishing his ranks with men eager for revenge against Rome. But winter also exacted its toll. The intense cold killed most of the surviving elephants. The wounded succumbed to infections, and Hannibal lost the sight in one eye due to a disease contracted in the Italian marshes. Even so, when spring arrived, he was ready to march again. The Trebia was only the beginning. The following year, on the shores of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal would ambush and destroy another consular army, killing 15,000 Romans and the consul Flaminius himself. and in 216, on the fields of Cannae, he would execute the supreme masterpiece, a double envelopment that would annihilate 70,000 Romans. In a single day, the worst military defeat in Roman history. The tactics Hannibal used at the Trebia, the calculated provocation, the use of terrain, the ambush from the rear, the envelopment from the flanks, would be refined and perfected in each subsequent battle. Generals would study his methods for millennia. Napoleon would call him a master. Modern military strategists still analyze his maneuvers in war academies around the world. But for the men who died in that frozen December on the banks of a river in northern Italy, Hannibal was not a genius to be studied. He was death incarnate, the predator who transformed their own terrain into a trap, who used cold as a weapon, who made the river an accomplice to massacre. The Trebia River still flows through the fields of Emilia-Romagna, its waters winding between green hills and quiet villages. Tourists who pass by its banks rarely know what happened there. There are no grand monuments, no bronze statues, only water flowing as it flowed more than 2,000 years ago, indifferent to the history it witnessed. But for those who know the story, the Trebia still whispers. It whispers of a general who crossed impossible mountains to fulfill an oath of vengeance, of a consul whose ambition blinded him to the trap closing around him, of 40,000 men who marched to their deaths on a winter morning, convinced that victory was certain, and of a truth that history repeats infinitely, that brute force, however great, can always be defeated by a mind that knows how to use it against itself. On that December morning, 20,000 Romans learned that lesson. They learned it with their final breaths, with their bodies freezing in the red snow, with the sound of enemy trumpets echoing in their ears. And the world never forgot, because some battles are not merely victories or defeats, they are warnings carved in blood. And the Trebia was the first warning that Hannibal Barca was no ordinary enemy. He was a master, he was a nightmare, and he was only just beginning.